I want to start with just a shout out to the Landfire folks. Jim Smith and Randy and all of y'all have been so supportive and helpful in listening to users. And a number of times I've been like, hey, where do I find this? Or can you help us make sure we're interpreting some of this stuff right? And that includes in Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands, where we were providing some feedback of stuff we found, and then y'all worked on it and made some improvements. And so I just have to start with a big shout out to y'all working so hard to make these products useful and listening to users. And it's always a joy, and y'all just jump right in, doing the best with something that's really, really challenging, but also very useful. To give you a little background about why we're even doing some of this work related to fire regimes, I wanted to talk real quickly about the Southeast Conservation Adaptation Strategy. And so this is the umbrella we're doing this work under. So this is a federal, state, nonprofit, private partnership of folks working together across 15 states and 2 territories, including going all the way out to the full U.S. waters in the Atlantic and the Gulf. And this was actually started by state wildlife agencies and 15 federal agencies with natural resource responsibility in the Southeast US. And so this is the original, this is the work that we're doing it under. And the partnership itself, which started in 2011, it focuses on 3 big things. One, kind of setting a bold vision and ambitious goal collaboratively across that big Southeast region. Designing a conservation blueprint for action. And so we're going to talk a little mostly about that component and how the land fire information fits into some work we've done on improving one of the indicators. And then also works on clearing barriers to cross-boundary collaboration. Another thing that Landfire does particularly well when we need to talk about things across multiple states, across multiple regions, it gives us a shared language to do that. So the big vision of the partnership is this connected network of lands and waters, support thriving fish and wildlife populations, and improved quality of life for people. And so the depiction of what that connected network could look like is displayed in this conservation blueprint. So these are the priorities for a connected network of lands and waters, 50% of the entire Southeast, including highest high, medium, and priority connections. So this is actually the 10th annual update of the conservation blueprint. So again, like Landfire, we try to keep things fresh and update information regularly to keep up with the changing landscape and as we learn more things. So the conservation blueprint, it's used quite a lot. We've helped more than 500 people from over 200 organizations, bringing in new funding and informing their conservation decisions. And has helped bring in more than 400 million in conservation funding to protect and restore over 400,000 acres, which is big in the Southeast. That might be small if you're out west and you're like, wow, we do stuff, millions and millions, but big in the Southeast. And it's pretty much, I would say, every day I'm learning about a new blueprint use or helping out with some. And so that's really exciting. And again, I'm sure y'all see that in Landfire as well. You're like, oh, learning it. It's like, oh, here's a cool new way my information is being used. Oh, I didn't even know about that. So lots of really cool uses, and that's a lot of fun to be working closely with users and kind of learning what we can improve and how people are using it. So the way the conservation blueprint comes together is it starts with a series of natural and cultural resource indicators. So these are spatially explicit GIS layers, they're 30-meter pixel. And so we start with all those different things. What are the things that we want to make sure we're capturing in this connected network of lands and waters? Then we divide the region into zones. We use the indicators to rank areas within the different zones. We add additional connectivity, and then that gets us to the blueprint itself. I'm not going to dive too much into all the other steps, but really what we're talking about is one of the key inputs in step 1, which is an improvement in one of our indicators related to fire regime and fire frequency. So some things to know about these indicators. Like I said, they're the ones that help identify these priority places for a connected network of lands and waters. The layers and the full documentation are publicly available for download and new viewers. So when we release the blueprint in the fall every year, we have all the code, the layers, all the documentation, including known issues we learn about as we're doing it. So those are all publicly available. We're always shooting for at least the full 15 state coverage. And we do have folks that use the indicators. So our user support staff use indicators to help people find their part of the blueprint. And if we have a little time, I'll show you an example of how that sort of works. But you got this big plan and you're just like, well, but what's my part of it? I care about these things, or this is the kind of stuff I'm focused on. So we spend a lot of time helping unpack the larger plan and help people find out, okay, what's their role in the bigger connected network of lands and waters. So just a few things to keep in mind. And so we started with our previous version of fire frequency as an indicator was very simple. And in the Southeast, we have a lot of ecosystems that rely on regular fire. That's a key part of our pieces. You'll see some more images related to that. You'll see it soon as well. But we started out fairly simply with this fire frequency indicator that just looked at the last, like not even quite 10 years and looked at like how often areas were burned, just as a signal, to sort of say like, well, how often is fire happening? So we were using MTBS and we're also using Landsat burned areas. And so this was our starting point we've done for the last couple of years, just to kind of flag what are those areas where active management is happening in fire dependent systems. So this is where we were at the beginning. But, you know, one of the challenges is, as I'm sure y'all are thinking about, number one, you know, the fire regime is different across all these different places as well. Some things need more regular fire, some things need less regular fire. And also, as our user support folks and as people were using the blueprint and this particular indicator, you know, it was less often to say, hey, we've been burning this thing regularly, but more often to say, hey, look at how little fire we have in this place. And we know there should be more fire here, but look at how little there is, as to kind of make the case for more resources and the importance of restoration and fire in some of these places. So that started us off on a bigger update of this indicator to better capture the historic fire regime and how the regime was doing right now. And we ended up looking at these 3 steps to better reflect the fire regime. The first part is this kind of idea of like, well, is this a fire adapted area? Is there some kind of regular fire? Some of these systems, you know, the historic fire regime might be 40 years or 60 or something like that versus something that needs to be burned every 2 to 3 years. So look at that question. The other question is, well, how's it doing right now? Is it in its interval? Does it look like it's been burned within that interval? And the other question, how far has it departed in the past, right? So you got these areas where you may have kept in their interval for a while and then resources or something else has gotten in the way and things are starting to regrow. You're out of the interval, but you're like, oh, there's some good bones here. We're just behind. And there's some places that are fresh, right? You know, we're just bringing fire and restoring for the first time, but it's got a long, I like to think it's like, oh, you got a shady past. You know, it's been a while. So these were the kind of components we wanted to better capture in the next version of this indicator, which is going to be out in the fall. So first step, is this a fire adapted area? We kept it fairly broad and just looked at a historic fire return interval of less than or equal to 20 years. You know, anything over that, it's just pretty hard to get historical burn data to figure out whether you're even in the interval or not. But also those are places that you're getting some fire the last few decades. If you haven't seen fire, you're going to be running into some problems. And we get that from the LANDFIRE biophysical settings. We've used that for a lot of stuff. That historic fire interval is really super helpful to be able to get at the variation of historic ecosystems across the geography. So that's the first step. Is this something we can even really look at or should be looking at for regular fire? This is what that looks like across the Southeast. As you can see, it is most of the southeastern United States has a fire return interval less than 20 years. Actually, most it's less than 9 years. That map looks very similar if you even bring it that far. So this is what it looks like. Most of the places should be having fire over a few decades, with a few notable exceptions. The biggest, most notable exception is this big empty area across the lower Mississippi Valley. Now there are exceptions, Grand Prairie and other different components of there, but in general, you have a lot of historic forested wetlands here, for those that don't know the area as well. So as a really big floodplain system, you wouldn't be getting fire as much in most of that area. But almost everywhere else, yeah, we're looking at that place. All right, so that was step 1. This is even a fire adapted area. And then the next thing was asking the other fun question. Another fun question is like, well, is it in its historic fire interval now? And that's always a challenge, capturing what's being, where fire is happening, especially fire footprints, getting down to that level of detail. And so basically what we did for this is we combined for getting at the fire, we used two things, USGS Landsat burned areas, which is, again, exactly what it sounds like, uses Landsat to estimate burned areas. That's particularly helpful, especially on private lands and things that LANDFIRE is not capturing in its disturbance as well. So this is very much remote sensed style kind of piece. And then we also use the LANDFIRE disturbance layers because they capture a lot of stuff that the Landsat burned areas miss and have that really extensive list of data contributors that they're pulling in fire data from. So we combine the two, basically sort of like if one or the other says there's fire, then we counted that as a kind of combined layer. And then we use the LANDFIRE biophysical setting to compare that and say, well, okay, this is supposed to be burned every 5 years, give or take a small percentage. Has it actually been burned in that time period? So then if we look at that, this is what it looks like if we think about the fire adapted areas that are in their historic fire interval now. And that's just a point in time, which is not too horrible, but way less than when we started from. So just a reminder, we started from here. This is all the places that are the fire adapted areas. And this is what we have left that seems to be in its historic fire interval now. Now, this is not including a lot of the other important components of the fire regime, right? So we're not talking about like the season of burn. We're not talking about the intensities. This is a very coarse, kind of simplistic version. That's just like return interval. So even this, then there's subsets that aren't quite in there. They're not in their rotation for other reasons, their regime for reasons. But this is what you end up with if we just look at fire adapted areas that are in that historic fire interval right now. So we take that. And then we go for the third piece, which is, well, how far is it departed in the past? So this is restoration potential. This is kind of separating these areas that have just been managed for decades and decades versus areas that are newly restored. And so it's the same source of information. We go from 1984 to 2024, so 4 decades. Any farther than that, I mean, even once you start getting into like the 80s, we're underrepresenting some fires just because of satellites and all that fun stuff. But we're going back through that time and really just looking for those flags of management. How far have we departed from where it should be in the past? So if we look at that piece here, so areas that are the darker red are the ones that are like low departure, 33% or less. And most of the landscape is in the more than 66%. Like you're pretty far off from your historic area. The white spots are the ones that were not the fire adapted areas. So we've got a few of those. Those again, if you start thinking about like, wait, what's in its historic return interval now and hasn't departed a huge amount over the last few decades, there are some places out there that are like that. They're still few and far between, but we wanted to be able to separate out those different components. Now there is one more step in which I think about as almost like the cleanup step of what we need to do. So we have this fire data, and some of it is remote sensed, and some of it is capturing fire, but maybe not the fire we're interested in. So I'll point out one thing that really pops in this area, South Florida, south of Lake Okeechobee. You got this area that pops. It's just like, oh yeah, look at that. It's been in a kind of regularly burned state, which is where it should be, for decades. That's great. Good on you. That's all sugarcane. It's being burned regularly, and that ecosystem historically would have been, marsh, salt marsh that's burned regularly. That's not the fire we're interested in. So we did some cleanup steps afterwards to really focus in on the fire that we're interested in this piece. So we did remove like LCD row crop because we're less concerned with people burning core husks or sugarcane fields or things like that. So we pulled that out. We also removed anything using NLCD that was barren or urban. In Barron, we found that that was often industrial facilities, and the fire was picking up. So the remote sense fire was picking up those big sets of flames that were coming off of certain industrial facilities. And then in urban areas, again, you just have lots of different types of fires in urban areas that weren't really, big bonfires and various other things that we weren't really shooting for. So, I mean, theoretically, the Landsat burned areas is again, it's sort of looking for this, you know, it's still like a 10 acre or so minimum patch size, but you get a lot of noise in urban areas and barren. So we pulled those out because those were mostly problematic ones. And the other thing we did just related to classification is we used data we have on floodplain inundation to remove wet areas because in Landsat they can look like fire scars. So you think about it like you're looking over the top and you've got an agricultural field and then suddenly, or just like even a natural area, and suddenly it goes black, a big black area, and then it goes away and then it regrows. And it's like, oh, that kind of looks from a remote sensing perspective, like looks like a fire scar. You missed the fire, but you got the burned part. So we also use that to pull out some of the wet areas because they look like fire scars. It's an imperfect trade-off. It's good because we're dealing with some misclassification. But one of the things we're running into right now is like, but people actually want to know fire in the salt marsh and how we're doing in the salt marsh. So we're working on that piece. But those are some of the cleanup steps we do in between to get at those pieces. So this is the final legend. It is a lot because we're trying to integrate a lot of information. So as far as the blueprint itself goes, we still need from an indicator, we need something that's like, oh, this is the most important place to capture in this connected network. And these are a little bit lower. So basically we have each of the different components that we were talking about. So this top category is it's a fire adapted area. It's in the fire regime and it had low departure from the historical fire regime. And then you sort of work your way down to like, yep, we're in the historic regime, but there's more and more departure. And then we get out of the regime but still not too bad on the departure. And then we go all the way down to urban, row crop, or just not a forested, like not a fire adapted area. So yeah, this legend was an adventure. Jim Smith knows he was part of the 19-person team that worked on this review team that worked on this indicator, and we went back and forth on lots of different versions, so it wasn't too confusing as we put it all together. So we have a lot of kind of information jam-packed in the legend. Of course, there's a lot more in the documentation too. And this is what it looks like visually. So those top parts, like over here, this is where we're sitting in that like 6, like low departure, and then all the way down, the white is that sort of 0 class. So it's bringing a little bit more nuance to just is it in the regime or is it not in the regime? And so we wanted to try to separate. We noticed when we kept it simple and said, what's currently in the fire regime, we got that mix of like, wow, these are the amazing no-brainer places people have been working on forever, or this is newly restored. And then, oh, we missed this amazing place that hasn't been burned in 10 years, but there's still good potential there. So this is where we got with the updated fire frequency indicator. And so next steps on that. So the indicator, the full documentation, all the code, it's Python code for ArcGIS. If anyone wants to use it, repurpose, think about it, anything like that. We always have links to the data itself. So everything's publicly available data you can download stuff from. And so that comes out with the rest of the blueprint update in the fall. And it's also going to be updated into the various viewers and reporting tools. Yeah, Adam, do you want to just put a link to the SECAS website and then we can get to all the different pieces? I'll show how to get
It's
there.
already in there.
Oh yeah, perfect. Okay, so that'll be in the blueprint viewers. And we're also working, and I'll show you a little about what this could look like. We're also working on trends as part of tracking progress towards the broader SECAS goal. So this is a point in time. How are they doing? How has that changed over time? Are we getting better? Are we getting worse? Where specifically and spatially are we like off track versus on track? And so I'll show you. So Adam put the link for the website over here. So I'll show you a couple things since I do have a couple minutes here. So once all the data are in here on the conservation blueprint, you can go ahead, for anyone that wants to just grab the data, you can download the data. Full package, it's got all the code, got all the layers, got everything. You can just grab it. Things are all up as web services, so you can go up into a classic ArcGIS atlas and you can grab some things. But the fun thing I wanted to show off, because it's fun, is one of the other ways that's for folks that want to explore and look a little bit under the hood of the blueprint and, like I mentioned, find their part of the blueprint itself. I'm not going to do a full tour of all the fun stuff that this viewer does, but I will highlight two cool things. One is this filter the blueprint option. So here's we've got this full blueprint here, and then we have all the different indicators. Now, this doesn't have the new fire frequency indicator in it yet, but it will in the fall. But I wanted to kind of show some of the fun stuff you can start doing here. So with any of the indicators, you can look and say, oh, okay, I've got this big area, but I really want to work in places that now I've said, okay, let's look at places that are recently burned. So I can go in and immediately pull that down and say, oh, just show me places that have been recently burned. And then I can start adding in other different components, like what's been recently burned, but also has maybe high importance for imperiled amphibians and reptiles, important for range restricted species. So I can start slicing and dicing this with all the different indicators. And I mean, as you can see, I can do it really quickly. So it allows you to play around and have fun with all the different components. So I just cleared all the little filters. I can go back if I'm interested in grassland and savanna restoration. So you can mix all these different components, look for important places for restoration, but then you can also mix in and say, see, I also am interested in places that are, high importance for grassland restoration, but also likely to become urban in the near future. So we can start pulling in a few of those places. And then we start narrowing down that bigger piece to a smaller set of components. So this is that sort of like finding your piece. I'm not going to talk about it as much, but also you can upload a shapefile and you can get a whole report of numbers and tables for whatever your shapefile area is. So percentages, acres, and also it will make maps for all of these indicators, like actual maps in the little PDF. So it's very fun. Okay, so I wanted to show that because that is coming soon. And the other thing I wanted to mention, since I did talk about what we're trying to do for trends, is another component of the partnership is tracking this progress towards a 10% or greater improvement in health function and connectivity of southeastern ecosystems. So we have that. And then we also look, well, we have near-term metrics. Well, in order to get there, we need a 1% improvement every 4 years. So every 2 years, we release an assessment of how we're doing on those pieces. And this is the high level assessment. So everything in the green, you're on track. In the yellow, you're going up, but not fast enough. And everything in the red is basically going the wrong direction. So we have this high level version of the goal report and tracking. Right now, we're in this indicator, we have, I think it's like fire and longleaf, which is somewhere in here. Prescribed fire and longleaf pine. So we track that from some of the reported stuff. And so we have this, but at the same time, that's the high level. We also have a more interactive story map for things that we can get down to a finer resolution. And that's the kind of stuff that we can also, I'll grab something that we have at finer resolution so you can kind of see. We'll go to like grassland savanna area, for example. So in this case, we're looking at trends in grassland savanna area, and we're summarizing it at a county level. So you can explore and look at some of those trends at finer levels than that. And this is the kind of level we think we can summarize the fire regime trends as well. So probably into like beginning of next year when we release the next goal report, probably in January, we're hoping to have some trends in fire regime at this level. So you could sort of look and explore and see, okay, how are we doing on areas that are within the historic fire regime over time? So that's a particularly fun one. And so that's something we want to integrate into this coming up in the very near future. So this is also another fun thing to play around in if you want to see. And we are working on updating that one for next year as we speak. So I got one more thing here. Let me bring this back up. So those are next steps. I always want to let y'all know if you're interested in using the blueprint, we actually have user support staff who help you for free. That's their job. So if you want to have someone talk about the blueprint to your organization, you're like, oh, I'm not quite sure. I'm interested, but I don't know how to use it in this context, or you need someone to help do maps. Adam Malcolm is one of our user support folks. He's on the call right there. There's the wave. So we have folks that can help you use the blueprint. We love doing it. It's like one of the most fun parts of our job. So a shout out on that. Big thanks. I already mentioned the big thanks to everyone at LANDFIRE. I had to do it at the top because y'all are awesome. Also to Todd Hobbaker and Melly Vanderhoof, who helped a ton on the Landsat burned areas USGS stuff. They've been on the review teams helping for years, and then all the different people on the fire frequency indicator review team. This is likely something we'll probably revisit again next year. We'll see. That might be something. Generally, some indicators will update, every year, some every other year, something like that. But if you're interested in kind of participating in another review team, Adam had the link to the SECAS website. At the bottom, you can sign up for the newsletter, and the newsletter will let you know when their review team's open. And they're open to anyone that wants to join the party. So that's what I got.
All right. While you're warming up, I'm going to jump right in. Rua, something that caught my ears right away was your nod to people on the ground trying to take all this amazing information and bring it down to possibly their field unit, their state, their smaller area. I'm wondering if you could talk about that a little bit more. I thought that was a really interesting point you made.
Yeah, it's an interesting, we have. I think on the fire side, we're always working with, I would say, two different types of folks that work at different scales. So we work a lot with land trusts and folks and like smaller resource folks, sometimes regional planning commissions in like cities and small bodies that just don't have a lot of capacity for detailed information. And sometimes they just don't have even expertise in some of those. So we help to try to translate things in an understandable way and bring information from different resources they might have. But other times it's, state wildlife agency folks or even federal agency folks that are doing planning at different scales. And sometimes they really are, hey, I want to do conservation at this scale and I need some numbers or some information on where those places are. So like one thing I didn't talk as much about, but is related to the biophysical settings and one of our other indicators are grassland and savannas. We've been doing a lot of work helping some folks in the Piedmont around grasslands. And there's a lot of situations we've had tribes, small nonprofits, state agencies wanting to be able to capture this sort of like how much grassland savanna used to be here because we're so much woody encroachment, so many pieces. So we've done a lot of that sort of just running the numbers so they can. I know in Virginia, one of the smaller nonprofits was using it for fundraising because they were trying to bring in resources to say, like, look, they do a lot of grassland restoration work with private landowners, and they wanted to come to their funders and say, look at how many acres should be out here and look at where we're at right now. But I think it's similar on the fire component of just we've worked with some folks that do a lot of prescribed fire and they want to be able to say, okay, here's how much fire is out on the landscape now, and here's how much should be there kind of pieces. But yeah, it is fun because, sometimes we're stepping between helping with, wildlife action plans at a big state level or state level project review, and then federal assessments, which are big multi-state. And then oftentimes it's little parcels of land trusts and nonprofits that are just, working on what they want to do.
Super fun. Thanks for that, Rua. Again, more questions, but I wanted to welcome Jeremy from the Hoosier National Forest. He's got his hand up, followed by Jim Smith. Hey, Jeremy, how are you?
Hey, I'm doing well. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, Jeremy, welcome.
Hey, so, Randy, you've been kind of part and parcel to this, here on the Hoosier, kind of going through biophysical settings, kind of redo. But, the one thing we notice with regularity, and mostly, kind of to our own fault, Indiana was kind of slow to doing this kind of work, was that, our vegetation potential is kind of underestimated just due to what the biophysical settings were at the beginning in the base data, right? And you may have covered this in the beginning. I was kind of late to the show today, but is there a way, or the possibility of, kind of getting, that potential updated so that it reflects to kind of what we really know on the ground about, what we used to have and what its departure is, from today's perspective?
Yes, that's a question for Randy or Jim on updating the biophysical settings.
Right. Yeah, I'll jump in there first, and then Rua, this may come back to you a little
Yeah.
bit.
Yeah.
So we've been doing some work on the Hoosier National Forest, for example, to update the biophysical settings because I think we're seeing in the literature that there was even more fire than we originally documented in the biophysical settings models. And I guess, just curious if you all are able to do any of that review work as part of this project or would be interested in talking about that more. My guess is that, there are probably some new citations, some new modeling efforts, some new understandings of historical fire regimes that would probably, in my experience so far, increase the amount of fire that was on the ground historically. But I think that's partly where Jeremy's going, is wondering if there's a review process, if you guys have noticed anything or had any feedback on the fire regimes within the biophysical settings.
Yeah, the two I could talk about in the Southeast, there are two ones that I think about that have had more intensive work that I think could lead to improvements. And y'all work with Dwayne Estes in the Southeast Grasslands Initiative, and I know they've been doing a lot of work on the Cumberlands and trying to look for opportunities to improve the biophysical settings up there. The other one that we've been working on, just having the base data information to help y'all update, because I think the problem isn't conceptual, it's just how do you actually depict it, is, in sections of the Lower Mississippi Valley, you have these like pimple mound grasslands, right? That are like you have this huge areas of big forested wetlands, but then you also have these small little topographical bumps that were likely historically like, more longleaf open pine kind of ecosystems. And so, but obviously you can't map something you can't see, right? You can know there are bumps, but you're not going to put it, where do I put this pixel? And so we've been working a lot with the Lower Mississippi Valley Bird Joint Venture and some other folks from NRCS who have been really interested in changing their practices, because right now their conservation practices and recommendations for that whole area is just like manage it like a bottomland forest. And it's like, well, that doesn't really make sense for those little kind of the pimple mound grasslands, but if you can't map them and you can't talk about them, then it's hard to make the recommendations. So there is some work, some folks working on, have done hand and working on automated recognition of those in a way that could, that y'all, when the time came and if there was an opportunity, we could be able to sort of depict those systems and just map them in the right places based on that kind of topography that doesn't easily come from the topo maps and the elevation stuff that we have, but it's still, based on basic aerial imagery and LiDAR. It's a lot like Carolina Bays, which are not quite what we're talking about, but the same idea where it's like, oh, you're hard to map because you're something someone can see in an aerial, but you're not something that like computers can see very well and automate. So those are the two. For the most part, they seem pretty good, I would say, especially for a huge area and all these different systems. And sometimes, sometimes when people will say, well, I think this is wrong, but then you'll often have just as many people on the other side saying, actually, I think it's longer. Actually, I think it's shorter. And I feel like if you get into that situation where people are like, okay, if you're somewhere in between, you're probably okay. But I would say there's a couple of spots that are ripe for improvement. Those are the ones that I immediately thought of. And there's definitely more improvements to go, but those are the ones that have come out the most. But yeah, we do. That's the cool thing about doing this and helping so many people is that anytime we find stuff like we did in the Caribbean or like we do regularly for NLCD, for LANDFIRE, for protected areas database, for all those different things, if we find an issue, we try to make sure we surface it to the folks. And whatever the pathway is to fix it, whoever know what's the pathway to fix it and send people either directly down it, or if they don't have a way, we can provide feedback back up. I think that's one of the really cool systems of using this information is like the better information helps make this stuff better, and then we can help ground truth and just provide cool stories of how people are using it, which is also nice.
Great. So next, Jim Smith and Haley, I'll call out your question from the chat. Thanks so much. Hey, Jim.
Hi, yeah, hi, Rua. Good to see you again. And I'm going to follow up on your feedback loop that you were talking about because I'm trying to remember. I remember the Puerto Rico Virgin Islands. It seems to me that was about current vegetation, right?
Yeah, we had two. There
Yeah,
was two things. There was one, I'm trying to remember exactly what it was, that was an easy fix
yeah,
um, that y'all fixed. I think it was in one of the sublayers. It wasn't current vegetation. I
yeah,
think it might have
yeah.
been elevation, where
Okay.
there was like a big glitchy issue on the side of one of the mountains, and then like
Yeah,
we brought that up, and then it was like the next version it was fixed.
yeah,
So and then that, but the current, I think the other one that was challenging is that a lot of the marinas end up
yeah.
as forests,
Right.
which is so funny. Like when we first, it's funny because at first you're thinking like, that's crazy. Why in the world would a marina end up like a forest? And then you think about it and you're just like, oh, it's a bunch of wood, some of which wood is really tall, and it's surrounded by water. If I
Yeah.
was a satellite and you explained what a wet forest looked like to me, I'd be like, yeah, trees sticking up, water, cool. So that was one of the ones, the marinas getting classified as
Yeah.
forests was,
Yeah,
I
that's
think,
the one I
one that
remember
comes to mind
too.
too.
That's what I was remembering. And just to pass on that, that was, of course, the mapping teams at Arrows who responded to that and made those changes. So we passed the shout out to them. But the point is that you were very specific about what the issue was. You didn't just tell Landfire, I don't like the way you map forested wetlands, which is not helpful to people making maps. So for anybody listening, if you have feedback from Landfire, we'd certainly like to hear it. But the more specific you can be and the examples that you can provide is what helps us actually make changes and improve the product, not general statements like that. The second part of my question was, how will people know when this is available, Rua? How are you going to make it public or promoted or whatever so that people would know when this becomes available?
Yeah, so right now, the latest, because we're on that sort of a yearly release, we're promoting it when we're talking to people, mentioning as it's going up in the fall. It'll go out in the newsletter when it's out, and then we'll announce it in our webinar series and a few other places. But one thing, and maybe Adam and I can chat about this a little bit too. One thing we've done is in the past has targeted a few key audiences through their newsletter that's more focused on the specific improvements, instead of just the blueprints out, but like, with a significant improvement in some of our like fire indicators, that might be a good one to talk to some of the newsletter avenues, which often will share some of the stuff we have, but just make sure that it goes through folks that are interested in fire and a few of the other newsletters that people would read and be interested in. So, but yeah, it's usually because we're on a regular cycle and we're sort of always talking about when things are out. We don't usually have as much of a huge release piece, but I think targeting the specific improvements, I think could help get new people interested in it. And we do, everyone that's been to, so if you've been to a blueprint workshop or participated in a team, we give people a heads up too about things. So
Thanks for the question, Jim, and thanks for
yeah.
that, Rua. Haley, thanks for your question in the chat. I will read it, but please feel free to come off mute and turn your camera on if you want to clarify. Great presentation, Rua. For clarification, the Landsat data is any birding, both wildland fire or prescribed fire. So the fire indicator is therefore quantifying any type of fire on the landscape within the southeast, and if it falls within its historical fire regime. So yeah, basically you're counting wildland fire and prescribed fire, I think is.
Yeah, correct. And I know there are, I think Melanie on the Landsat side and a few other people are working on if there are ways we can separate out a few things, the wildland versus prescribed, based on just things like intensity and a few other kind of components. So it is right now. Now, obviously, the land fire disturbance, we can separate out a lot of some we don't know, but a lot of it is separated out to prescribed versus not. And also, we have seasonality, which we're not using at this point. But yeah, right now it's any fire, whether it's prescribed or wildland. And there are people working on that to see if there are some, not necessarily, I don't think it would be a definitely prescribed versus definitely wildland fire if you're doing it from remote sensing. But I think something that's more like likely prescribed fire or likely wildland fire piece, I think it could be possible, and I know there are people who are working on it, but it is not integrated right now.
Thank you,
Great
Rua, and
night.
thanks, Randy. I did want to follow up really quick. It's really awesome to see SECAS is working on this, Rua. I wasn't aware of the new fire indicator, and that's really cool to see for the Southeast since that's hard to parse out here. But I'm curious with, I know it's really hard to get data on prescribed fire, permitting from states and private landowners, but I know there's one effort to make a database of that for the Southeast that
Mhm.
Tall Timbers was
Yep.
spearheading. I'm not sure if that data I don't know if they have it like available spatially, but I know you can ask them for it. But I just looking at that map, I'm surprised Georgia and Florida don't have more falling in with their historic fire regimes because they are the biggest prescribed burners in the whole country. That was my only thought when I
Yeah,
saw that.
it's interesting. One of the things that happens when you correct for historic fire regime, there's definitely a lot more burning in Florida. And there is just even shows up there. But also, the Florida has some of the shortest historic fire regime rotations as well. So even within longleaf, you start looking at some of the areas they just burned more regularly. And so you also have that sort of additional challenge of it's putting on some additional information to like, here's how much we're burning versus like how much burning happened historically. And so I don't think that's all of the story, but it was something that struck me that I was thinking about all the burning that was happening further south. And then when you look at the pieces, you're like, oh, huh. Yeah, there are shorter rotations and bigger areas that are in shorter rotation kind of fire regimes. And so they have to work harder to burn too. Yeah, I've looked in the past about the permits. I think the problem of just getting the fire footprints from the permits is particularly challenging, but I think it's a good extra source of information, especially for separating out prescribed fire to complement those pieces. So let's look at the spatial of all the fire, but then we can also look at the permits and see how are we doing on, and again, the permits don't necessarily tell you how many acres are actually burned versus but I think they're both complementary sources of information.
That's a really interesting point too, that Florida and Georgia, like some of our these Southeast states need to work harder to fall within their
Yeah,
historic fire regime. That's a really
I,
interesting
I
thought.
knew it conceptually, but it wasn't until I started looking at those pieces and be like, oh, that longleaf is supposed to burn every 2 years versus this longleaf up in the Sandhills in North Carolina is supposed to burn every 5 years. And if you think about it, that means you've got to burn twice as much in the same longleaf ecosystem just to keep up with the historic fire regime. And it's like, that is not a small, once you start getting into that level of like, well, that's a lot of different. Yeah, I had not thought about it as being that extreme until I started looking at them. And I mean, it makes sense, like thinking about the ecosystems. I grew up in Florida, so like, yeah, the fact that Virginia, North Carolina, you know, grassland savannas maybe don't need to burn historically didn't burn as much and as regularly is not crazy. But yeah, it struck me the same thing, Haley. And then when I looked at those, I was like, oh wow, okay. This is just providing some additional helpful context before just like how much area is being burned, how much burning is happening.
Jim, so you have your hand up.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
thanks
So
for that
I'm back.
conversation, Haley and Rua.
Yeah, I'm back. A couple of other sources of prescribed fire data are the twig produced by SWRI, Southwest Ecological Research Institute, but it does cover the Southeast. And then there's the National Fuels Treatment Database that's produced by Timmons Group under contract to the DOI. Now, the thing about LANDFIRE, twig, permits, NFT, none of them are perfect. They all have their sort of goals and constraints and things like that. So it's almost like you have to look at them all to get a real picture of where controlled burning is actually happening. It's just nobody does it all as well as maybe we would like. Okay, so that's that. There are other sources besides Landsat burned area, LANDFIRE, that you can use to try to get controlled burn data, actual controlled burn data, not permits. Okay. The other thing I was going to point out is sometimes people are confused by BpS by the names. It sounds like a forest in the name, but it might have one or two grassland succession states.
Yeah.
If you go and you look at it, you might see that, the regeneration class or the early succession states are grass, even in the southeast. So if you're looking at BPS and looking at using it, make sure you look at the description so that you can see whether or not there are things like changes in life form within that BPS that might be of interest to you. So we found that out. I'm glad you brought up grasslands because, like Reed Noss and Bryce Hanbury basically, said that LANDFIRE undermapped grasslands. And we may have. I can't say we did or we didn't. But we just tell people to make sure that you look at the descriptions to really understand, because BPS is an ecosystem, not a cover type. So you do need to take a look in detail to really understand it.
Yeah, I think the challenge with just using the BPS in some cases is when you sort of have that lump of, like you said, Jim, like different successional stages or components. I find the fire frequency is really helpful because, in addition to the description, because it sort of tells you like, okay, is there fire coming in and keeping part of this open into a more savanna-like system, even if it's like forks? It's like whoever's looking at it, is it a Piedmont prairie or is it a short-leaf forest, right? It's like, yes, it is those things. But yeah, there's definitely a messy middle where you got to look under the hood and find that stuff. And yeah, with all the fire data, this is why I love trying to build off of the stuff y'all are doing LANDFIRE, because y'all know and digest so many different sources of information regularly that in general, what we try to do with the blueprint is like, if somebody's already wrestling with these crazy integration issues to get us to a spatial footprint of fire, let's not redo that work. Let's amplify it and be like cheerleaders for it. Pull that out because we don't want to remake the, mistakes y'all might have made early and learned from and fixed. And so we're like, all right, let's lift those things up. And then anytime we need to fill a gap, let's only fill it when no one else is doing it.
And with that, quick plug on my end, our colleague Sarah Hagan has put together a site that helps you with the beginning stages of a fire needs assessment, which in spirit is a lot like what you've done, Rua, you and your team. So I'll post that. She includes ArcGIS methods, some Python code, some R code that might help for people around the country doing something similar. She doesn't dig into some of the satellite imagery and stuff that you did, but all right, with that, I've got another one, Rua. I was curious about low intensity fire, if you're getting any feedback on that. I was curious how well that maps out in the Southeast. Like, those surface fires that might be in closed canopy, longleaf pine, for example.
Yeah, we're definitely missing some of them with the Landsat burned areas. That's in our known issues that we're not capturing some of those is, why when we can, we rely on stuff like the more, agency mapped or organization mapped stuff that comes out of LANDFIRE because we find that better captures, it's a little bit of a trade-off, right? Because when you remote sense things, you get some of the things that actually burned. When you have an agency fire perimeter, you have the area that's exposed the burn, but sometimes you overestimate what area got burned depending on who's giving you your fire footprint. But we definitely miss some of the low, especially when you have a thick canopy cover. You think about some of these oak woodlands in areas that are like, fire in the understory, but you actually have, not a dense canopy, but it's not as open as some of the other systems. We're definitely missing some of that, mostly on the private land or areas that LANDFIRE isn't able to capture with their disturbance pieces. And so, yeah, that is definitely a tricky part. But that's when those two data sets can kind of complement each other. But yeah, especially on the private lands. I mean, we're mostly like 90% private lands in the Southeast. So, that getting a lot of the fire is happening on public lands. But there's a lot of burn associations and landowner groups and stuff that are doing some amazing burning outside of those areas too. So